Good evening and welcome to Ognisko Polskie. We're still in very difficult times with a gradual return to a new normal with uncertainty about what will happen in the future. 80 years ago, in similarly uncertain times, Ognisko Polskie was established, and 80 years ago, Polish pilots fought with enormous skill, courage and success in the Battle of Britain. What is often forgotten is the Polish-Russian War and the Battle of Warsaw, the subject of tonight's event, the miracle on the Vistula. We have outstanding speakers this evening. We'll have two presentations followed by a panel discussion and then an opportunity to once again return to small breakout chat rooms. The first speaker is Norman Davies. Professor Norman Davies is a historian known for his many publications on the history of Europe, Poland and the United Kingdom. Professor Davies' first book, White Eagle, Red Star, The Polish-Soviet War, 1919 to 20, covers the Polish-Soviet War and proves the determined attempt by the Soviet Union to provoke a conflagration across Europe, which was foiled by the newly liberated Poland. Our second speaker is Paul Latawski. He's a senior lecturer in the Defence and International Affairs Department, the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. He has written on NATO enlargement, Polish defence transformation, sub-regional conflicts, and the 20th century wars, including the construction and reconstruction of Poland, and his work such as Great Britain and the Rebirth of Poland, 1914 to 18. The panel discussion will be led by Jerzy Kolankiewicz. Professor Kolankiewicz was the director of the UCL School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies and Professor of Sociology and Director of Economic and Social Research for Central Europe. Our first two speakers will be joined by Richard Butterwick-Pawlikowski. Professor Pawlikowski is a chair at University College London and in 2016 was awarded the Bronze Medal Gloria Artis for his service to Polish culture. I'd like to now ask Professor Davies to start this evening's event.
It's very hard to believe that a whole century has passed since the Battle of Warsaw in August 1920, a battle in which my own father-in-law fought as a 16-year-old volunteer. And it's even harder to believe that nearly 50 years have passed since I wrote my own first book, White Eagle, Red Star, the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 20. So, to be brief, just 4 or 5 general points. Firstly, the Battle of Warsaw was an event of world importance, not just a parochial skirmish in the long history of Polish-Russian wars. The Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 20 had 2 parts. In 1919, it was a territorial war, a war of the frontiers, like many other wars of the period when the new states were trying to establish their national territories. But in 1920, it took on a completely different form. It became, as I said, an event of world importance, in which it became an ideological war in which the Bolshevik regime in Soviet Russia attempted to carry out its fundamental aims. So a word about Bolshevik ideology. The Bolsheviks had universal pretensions. They thought they were starting a worldwide revolution. They also realized that by launching that revolution in Russia, they'd started it in the wrong country. According to Marxist theory, Russia was the last place where you should start a proletarian revolution, because the proletariat in Russia was very small. And the Bolsheviks, from an early stage, accepted that as soon as they were established in Russia, they should expand their revolution to the rest of Europe. And this is what happened in 1920. In 1919, the Bolsheviks were occupied with the Russian Civil War. As soon as they'd controlled the larger part of Russia, they decided to send their armies west into Europe. Poland's place in this is what I think Trotsky called the Red Bridge. It was the link between Eastern Europe, Russia, and the more developed countries of Western Europe, Germany, France, and Britain. And at the beginning of the campaign of 1920, Marshal Tukhachevsky boasted that before the summer was out, he would be galloping through the streets of Paris. So this is very much a war, an offensive, a campaign against Europe as a whole, not just against Poland. Secondly, which follows, 1920 was a key moment in the history of world communism. Before the campaign, Trotsky, who was the Commissar for War, had argued that the Red Army was too weak to attack Europe, that the revolution should move into Asia before Europe. He made the famous statement, the road to London goes through Calcutta. He was, of course, overruled, and the campaign of 1920 went ahead. After the defeat, the Bolsheviks were thrown back onto their own resources in Russia. They had to regroup. They formed the Soviet Union in 1923, and a system which under Stalin was called socialism in one country. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, the communist movement was slowly spreading through many countries of the world, including China. And China, of course, eventually joined the communist fold. Now, after all those years, Russia is no longer communist, and China is now the only important state which still owes allegiance to the communist ideology. 1920, which is probably of more interest to everybody listening. 1920 was the key moment in the formation of Poland's modern independence. 18 months earlier, November 1918, Polish independence had come about, not through the feats of arms of the Poles themselves, but through the collapse of three great empires. But once established, the Polish Republic had to defend itself against several strong neighbors. First against Germany in Poznania and Silesia, then against the Ukrainians in the south, and then against the Russians in the east. I think we should notice that in that period, several nations, several nascent nations like Poland did not succeed in defending their independence, and they went under. The obvious example is, of course, neighboring Ukraine. 1920 is also an occasion where the Western powers behaved very badly not in accordance with their principles, and showed themselves to be much weaker than they thought. David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, completely understood the situation. He was one of many Westerners who believed that Poland had attacked Russia, not vice versa. That's because he didn't understand that Kiev in 1920 was no longer in Russia, but was in Ukraine. Lloyd George had no idea about Pilsudski. At that time, people were judged as to whether they had supported the Western Allies in the First World War or whether they had supported the Germans and Austrians. And Pilsudski, whose legions fought under Austrian command in the First World War, was judged to be a pro-German, which of course is totally nonsensical. All the Allied initiatives in 1920, diplomatic and so on, were failure. From the Curzon Line, the proposition of a ceasefire in July 1920, to the Inter-Allied mission, which sent some very important people to Poland who did virtually nothing. The only member of that mission who did anything was Lord Dabenon, the British ambassador from Berlin, who wrote a very stirring book called The 18th Most Decisive Victory of World History. Most importantly, 1920 was the defining moment in the establishment of modern Polish identity. By uniting the nation in defense against the Bolsheviks, it gave Poles a strong sense of who they were and who they are. And that strong sense of national identity, despite all the ups and downs in the intervening period, has never lost them. This was the day when the Poles, after 123 years of dependence under foreign rule, gained the confidence in themselves to have their own state, and it gave them the confidence, I think, to survive in the terrible years which are still ahead of the Second World War. Poles had been associated in much of modern history with lost causes. But this was the time, this was the great occasion when the cause was not lost, when the Poles prevailed. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that, Norman. Can you see me, or have we?
I can't see you.
It's Julek here.
Yeah, I can. Now I can see you.
Because we're going to do a quick transfer over from your section over quickly to Paul Latawski. Both of you, who I remind you, many years ago, once taught me at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. So there's quite an amazing sort of connection here. But victory is indeed pretty amazing in the sort of Polish, well, what can we call it? History, military history. Paul, are you with us there yet?
Yes, can you hear me?
Great. Yes, I can hear you. I'll hand over to you and you can give us your version of the art of military. What was the title?
Operational art.
Operational art.
Operational art.
Explain to us all what that means. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I just want to thank Jan for the fulsome introduction. There's just one minor correction. I'm in the Department of War Studies, not Defense and International Affairs, and have been for a long time. But details, it doesn't matter. What do I want to talk about today? Well, when I was asked to speak, I actually decided to do something on the Battle of Warsaw that reflected the Polish success in the practice of operational art. So, hence the title of my talk, Masterclass in Operational Art, the Battle of Warsaw, August 1920. And what I want to do is look at the Battle of Warsaw from a military perspective. I think Norman nicely provided the wider picture of the importance of the battle, but I want to look at it as a military success. And in doing so, I basically look at it with three big chunks. The first being the crisis the Polish army faced in the summer of 1920. Consider the response that they organized to that crisis, and then actually look at the battle and how it unfolded and in so many ways reflected a very good practice in this idea of operational art. Now, having mentioned operational art at least 6 times, it's probably worthwhile for me to actually provide everybody with a definition. What is operational art? What does it mean? Well, operational art is typically described in Western Army doctrine as the gearing between the strategic and the tactical levels that involves the orchestration of a series of tactical actions for the attainment of strategic objectives. Now, if I haven't put everybody to sleep with that definition, maybe I can make it a little bit more straightforward. Basically, when you're talking about the strategic level, that's the very big picture. For Poland in 1920, it's to defeat the Soviet attack and to secure Poland. The tactical level is what all those Polish soldiers were doing in their units and formations at the sharp end of battle fighting. So how do you actually realize the strategic level through your tactical action? And that's where the operational art comes in, how you orchestrate, integrate, coordinate all those small battles taking place all over on the battlefield to actually achieve a major result. So that's, in a nutshell, operational art. But I'd like to move on to the first point, which is to consider the threat and the crisis that Poland faced. It came on the back of Pilsudski's grand scheme to try to create a Ukrainian buffer state. The Bolsheviks essentially finished the Civil War and could now devote their energies to dealing with what they saw as the Polish threat. And so you see from late May 1920 in Ukraine, the southwestern front of the Soviet forces under Alexander Yegorov, who was a 37-year-old ex-Tsarist lieutenant colonel, with Stalin being his political minder, launching a counterattack that would eventually push the Polish army back to the start line when it launched its offensive in Ukraine in the spring. And indeed, Yegorov's key asset was the Koin Armia, which we've got Yegorov there. His key asset was the Koin Armia, the first cavalry army, which was his main striking instrument. But the Bolsheviks also were, in fact, mustering a much larger military effort to the north in the Belarusian area. It was their Western Front, which was led by a 27-year-old Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who was an ex-Tsarist junior officer later becomes well known as a military theoretician before Stalin shoots him in the late 1930s. He similarly had a cavalry strike force, the Cav Corps, under another ex-Tsarist officer, a 33-year-old guy. So this sets the scene, and on the 4th of July, the Western Front launched its offensive under Tukhachevsky and quickly begins to push the Polish army out of Belarus. There's an attempt to establish a stable front with 4 successive defensive lines not gelling. And indeed, the Polish army is having a great deal of difficulty fighting a defensive battle that would break the Soviet momentum of their attack. The Polish army, moreover, is suffering serious losses in men and materiel. It's suffering from plummeting morale. And I think an interesting indicator of that is that there's a certain level of desertion that's beginning to set in units. And so by the end of July, when particularly the Western Front is pushing into what is ethnographic Poland, it is actually an army that looks like it's very much in trouble. But more importantly, the Western Front in particular is forming an existential threat to Poland. And in this crisis, it has to be said, the Southwestern Front is being perhaps more successfully contained in the South, which provides a kind of general context of the crisis that is quite important. And it's useful at this point to talk a little bit about the terrain in which the battle was fought over, the big geographical canvas in which it took place. One of the important factors falling out of this was that there was a comparative low density of forces on both sides. It's not like a First World War battlefield of a continuous trench system with a high density of forces on either side of the line. Given the vast scope of the region, the geographical scope, the reality is that you fight along rail lines, key towns, key river crossing points. You don't have anything that resembles a continuously held front. More than that, the whole battle space is affected by what is a kind of bifurcation, division into 2 distinct regions. The Pripyat marshes, or in Polish, the Polesieja, is a marshland full of water courses, and it's not an area that makes for great going for an army, for movement. Hence, movement east or west tends to go north and south of the Pripyat marshes. And if you add to this, in the northern sector, the northwest front of the Bolshevik advance, as they move beyond the line of say, Brest-Litovsk, Białystok, you're also getting into that northeast quadrant of Poland where the rivers tend to run east-west, the Vistula, the Wisła, the Narew, and the Bug. And so for an invading army coming north of these river lines, in order to move south or swing south, river crossing points become very critical to seize. Hence, you've got, for example, on the Narew, towns like Łomża, Ostrołęka, Pultusk are key crossing points. On the Wisła, it's going to be Modlin, Płock, and Włocławek. And so you've got geography playing a role that is quite important. Now, what about the Polish military response? And I think the place to start is actually, and again, on this map, you can see the direction of the river lines. You can see how they shape movement as the Bolsheviks move west. But the response was very much driven by key personalities that were very important to the story. On the Polish side, clearly the most important figure is Józef Piłsudski, 53-year-old from the Kresy, particularly from Lithuania. He considered himself a Lithuanian. He emerges at the end of the war as the leading de facto leader of Poland. He's the Naczelnik Państwa, the chief of state, and the Naczelny Wódz, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He's a pre-war member of the Polish Socialist Party. He's the guiding force for the wartime Polish legions, a man of held in great affection by his legionary soldiers who referred to him as the commandant. And the crisis in 1920, the Bolshevik advance, was, I would argue, to be the greatest test of his leadership, both as a political and a military leader. And in this crisis, it has to be said, Piłsudski acts with considerable decision. He sacks commanders who he feels are too tired, too pessimistic, too lacking in drive. He wants men in charge of his armies and formations who are full of, who have an iron will and who have a belief in victory. And perhaps what illustrates this shift in command is his appointment in late July of General Tadeusz Jordan Rozwadowski. He's a former professional officer in the Austro-Hungarian army. He held wartime divisional command quite successfully and a number of key staff appointments. He brings to being chief of the general staff his new appointment that not only drive and energy, but also professional military expertise. Indeed, he was Poland's first chief of the independent Poland's first chief of the general staff, commanded operations in early 1919 in terms of the relief of Lvov, and then was the military representative on the Polish delegation at the Paris Peace Conference. Piłsudski had a great deal of confidence in him, and Piłsudski said of him, he always preserved his resolution, energy, and moral strength. He believed in eventual Polish victory. The other key character that is, two other key characters that are worth mentioning is the French General Maxime Weygand. He was the senior military representative on the inter-allied mission that was sent to Poland at the height of the crisis. Indeed, the mission rather thought that they could place Weygand in charge of the Polish army. Piłsudski refused to engage with him. Indeed, Abranon gives an account of where at a meeting with Weygand, Piłsudski just spoke in Polish and actually refused to talk to Weygand. Rozwadowski was not any more keen in seeing Weygand take over control of the Polish armed forces, but he essentially became, Rozwadowski became Weygand's point of contact, and he essentially limited Weygand to a limited advisory role. Daily meetings for discussion, and then Weygand typically would do a short submission with his ideas or comments. And it's quite interesting, you know, there's a myth about Weygand that has been propagated by historians who should know better, that he was responsible for the design of the Polish victory. But in fact, later he wrote, the victory was Polish, the plan Polish, and the army Polish. So these are three characters at the top. Another character that's important to mention is General Władysław Sikorski, the commander of the Fifth Army, whose role in the counterattack will be quite significant. Now, planning the Polish operation began as soon as Rozwadowski got back, who started generating planning. That's what a chief of a general staff does, and that's what a general staff does, is planning. And by the 5th of August, he met Piłsudski and presented various options for counterattack. A rather conservative option of keeping a strong reserve at Warsaw and then attacking east toward Garwolin or Minsk Mazowiecki, or a larger maneuver into the flank and rear of Bolshevik forces from the line of the river Wieprz east of the Vistula. And Piłsudski, after spending a night of deliberations, and his year 1920 book, Rok 1920, is very much, it gives a vivid description of his agonizing over that decision. But he decided in the end to go for the second option, the counterattack from the line of the Wieprz. It was a riskier option, but one that offered the promise of a more comprehensive defeat of Bolshevik forces. Also, it has to be said, Rozwadowski did persuade Pilsudski of the importance of Sikorski's Fifth Army launching a counteroffensive in the north. Now, having essentially decided the plan on the 6th of August, the next step was to actually begin to reorganize the Polish military effort for the counteroffensive. And this meant restructuring commands, it meant moving forces around. For example, a northern front was created under General Haller that had 3 armies, Sikorski's 5th, along the Modlin Vikra river line. You also had Latinik's 1st Army. It occupied the fortified bridgehead of the Vistula, and then running south from Warsaw along the Vistula, you've got General Roya's 2nd Army essentially screening the length of the river. The central front was the 4th Army, and this was to be the strike group that would launch the attack to the rear of the Bolshevik forces. And again, you can see on the map, the longest arrows indicate what the strike group's task was meant to be. The southern front had managed to stabilize and contain the Bolshevik advance well enough to allow the divisions to be transferred from the southern front to reinforce the central and northern front for the counterattack. Indeed, there were 3 divisions, the 18th, which would go to Sikorski's 5th Army, and the 1st and 3rd Legionary divisions, which went to the 4th Army. Pilsudski had assumed that Tukhachevsky would concentrate on attacking the Vistula bridgehead. In fact, he was driving deeper into Poland in the direction of Torun. The counteroffensive date was provisionally set for the 17th of August, and now you had this problem of orchestration, moving to put all the pieces of the puzzle in place. And so you've got, for example, the redeployment of the 3 divisions. The Legionnaire divisions had to move 150 to 200 kilometers to get into position for the counterattack. More than that, they had to break contact with the enemy, get cleanly away, and undergo the movement. The 18th Division had an even longer move to make, in training in Lvov and eventually arriving just in time to the 5th Army north of Warsaw. So those were the kind of plans and the dispositions and the reorganization. So how did the battle actually go? Pilsudski decided to take command of the central front with the strike group on the Wieprz. It has to be said at this point, one of the imponderables for Pilsudski was the morale of his troops. They had been pushed back from deep in Ukraine and Belarus, and there were real questions about their morale and how well they would fight. Interestingly, when he arrived in the 4th Army area, he toured some of these units and came away realizing that in fact morale was quite strong, and that his soldiers indeed were certainly up for the fight. And then, so the battle actually begins on the 12th of August on the Warsaw bridgehead. There's a kind of seesaw battle there where the Bolsheviks actually get through some of the fortified lines, but are eventually pushed back after a seesaw battle that saw the town of Radzimin exchange hands. But this Bolshevik penetration of what was the most fortified and best resourced sector of the Polish front certainly sent a kind of wobble through the Northern Command. And one of the consequences falling from this was to advance the launch of the counterattacks for the Battle of Warsaw. On 14th of August, Sikorski launches his attack across the Vikra, heading northeast. It's interesting, he had to advance his start of the attack by 24 hours. And in a lot of ways, his attack had served the purpose of fixing the enemy, of engaging the Bolsheviks so that they're going to be dealing with the threat that he posed. But rather remarkably, he, despite having numerically inferior forces, he's making gradual and steady progress toward his objectives. And Pilsudski similarly decides that the strike group, the Fourth Army on the Vieprzh, needed to be launched earlier for about 24 hours. So on 16th of August, Pilsudski launches the counterattack. And in this counterattack, Pilsudski quite rightly identified that tempo was going to be critical. His troops had to get deep into the enemy rear as quickly as possible. As a matter of fact, his order just before the attack emphasized that they should move at szalone tempo, at a crazy tempo, to get as quickly into the rear areas of the Bolshevik Northwest Front as possible. Well, in general, it has to be said, it was an extremely successful counterattack on the Vieprzh and with Sikorsky. And, you know, the rest, as they say, is history. It led to not only the stopping of the counterattack, but essentially ending the existential threat to Poland, at least for the time being. Soviet losses were considerable. Tukhachevsky's forward elements, his Cav Corps, the most forward army of his, the Fourth, were essentially a write-off. 44,000 of them crossed the border into East Prussia to be interned. There were 66,000 Bolshevik soldiers made prisoner, and something in the order of 40,000 casualties, dead and wounded, inflicted on the Bolsheviks. So by any stretch of the imagination, it was a military success, and a military success, again, that I would attribute to the operational art. So to conclude, what are the lessons that I would put to regarding this battle a century later? The first lesson that I would put concerns the engagement with allies. The inter-allied military mission rather arrogantly thought it could take over running the war effort. And it quickly had to learn that and gain an understanding that to successfully engage allies, to offer constructive advice, you've got to not approach it with arrogance, but approach it with some humility and actually seeking to understand your partner. And I think this is an interesting lesson that is relevant today, particularly as so much of military life takes place in the context of alliances such as NATO. So there's a certain resonance with this issue if you were to look at Poland's role in NATO today and in how the rest of the alliance interacts with NATO, the importance of understanding. The second is this practice of operational art. You know, there are always a few battles that military historians like to latch on to illustrate operational art. And it's rather sad that the Battle of Warsaw is not studied more thoroughly by Western militaries for this example of operational art. Because what you saw successfully carried out was this orchestration and synchronization of tactical actions over a large area that delivered a strategic aim. And so when you look at the key events, the decisive points where this military action was orchestrated, the defense of the bridgehead, the Fifth Army's counterattack, the counterattack launched from the River Vieprzh line, all of these things represent a kind of classic integration at the operational level that we would describe as operational art. So hence why the title, A Masterclass in Operational Art, is how I would describe the Battle of Warsaw. Finally, I think there's an interesting issue a century on that perhaps we need to be a little bit more constructively critical in viewing the role of the key participant, Josip Pilsudski. I think it was undoubtedly the high point of military success for Pilsudski. He brought decisive leadership. he accepted enormous risks, and he imposed a strong, unbending will on the Polish military effort, all of which were extremely vital to the success of the Battle of Warsaw. And if I could make an analogy, there's some resemblance in Douglas MacArthur's driving through the amphibious operation at Incheon during the Korean War, which again had a similar major operational effect of nearly destroying the North Korean forces that had nearly overrun the peninsula. But perhaps where there is a similarity between MacArthur and Piłsudski is that inevitably, I think great leaders like this suffer sometimes from a degree of hubris. And these events of 1920 also point to Piłsudski's flaws as a military commander. In some ways, he operates like a military amateur because he frankly lacked formal military training and education that you would get in a normal military career. I mean, his ad hoc command arrangements, where as commander-in-chief, he decides to go and essentially command one of the armies, when one would think a commander-in-chief's role is to coordinate the big picture and all the moving parts. But I think where his legacy is perhaps most damaging is the post-war failure to learn lessons about the operational level of war in the Polish army. Interestingly, the Historical Bureau of the Polish General Staff actually put together and constructed a well-crafted series of tactical and operational studies, but they never finished the volume at the operational level dedicated to the Battle of Warsaw, which is rather a shame because one would have thought that should have been the first study to be done, not a lot of minor tactical ones. And it's perhaps somewhat ironic that the army that did learn about operational art from its experience in the Battle of Warsaw was the Red Army. Indeed, the Red Army by the Second World War becomes a master of operational art. And indeed, it's one of the major reasons for Soviet success in the later stages of the Second World War. So on that, hopefully not too controversial note, I'd like to end. And thank you all very much for your attention.
Oh, thank you very much, Paul. It's Ulick again. So we'll be taking a break. Many thanks to both Paul and Norman for their, well, they kept to the time limit. That's all I can say. So now I would like to ask George and Richard to unmute themselves and get ready for the next session, which is the discussion part. So here, I'll be handing over to George. Jerzy Kolankiewicz, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. All yours, and I'll keep in the background just in case everyone's got any really good questions for you later on. Okay. So
thank you very much, Jurek. Dobry wieczór. As a sociologist, I really want to put some questions which might stymie some of the artness or the strategy aspect of the miracle on the Vistula. I think anyone that reads through, as one has had to over the last couple of months, the various reminiscences of what happened 100 years ago, it's quite clear that what happened in 1920 was a series of mini miracles as opposed to one large miracle, i.e. the Battle of Warsaw. I think the first one, and the one that is closest to my own heart since it happened in the hometown of my father and grandfather, was Chechanów. It's not on the map, but it's made clear by both Tukaczewski and Sikorski that the Zagod, or the attack by the Ułany, on the 14th and 15th of August, which caused the Russian leadership of the Fourth Army to destroy their radio station and to disappear with their plans, in effect, according to Tukaczewski, meant that his army was cut off for at least between the 15th and the 18th and was unable to hear any orders. And in the end, that army carried on doing what it thought it ought to do rather than what it should do. So here you had a question of Polish spirit, the Ułany breaking into Ciechanów, which was under occupation from the 8th of August, and then having to retreat, but in the process causing mayhem. And this is now, I think, the basis. Some people have said that really it was the miracle at Ciechanów, which was almost as important as anything else that happened in terms of strategy. I would like to see what the historians would say about this, but it is quite clear that when the Polish technicians then took over and found out the wavelength of the remaining radio station, which was being used by the Bolsheviks, they, for 2 days, played the recital of the Gospel according to St. John, which meant that it couldn't be used by the Bolsheviks as a form of communication. Now, in a war which depended upon a kind of chessboard, where you didn't know who was next to you, whether they were Polish or Bolshevik, a breakdown in communication was absolutely critical. But again, looking at this as a sociologist, there seem to be so many things that happened by chance, happenstance, luck, or sheer bravery that make you think that here you had a concatenation of circumstances which came together providentially to provide victory for Pilsudski, but also for Sikorski, Haller, and others. Not least, we know that Pilsudski's plans actually fell into the hands of Tukhachevsky's army when they found an officer who had been, Polish officer who had been killed, but they thought that the plans were a provocation and were not real plans, and therefore chose to ignore them. Secondly, we know, and Norman has mentioned this in his book, the rivalry between Stalin, Tukhachevsky, Budyonny, and others meant that they were slow in following up some of their decisions, which then played into the hands of the Poles. So importantly, we can see that the final point of luck, and here I think again we have the international context, was that it wasn't until the 12th of August that ammunition so badly needed by the Polish army appeared at Skierniewice on its way from Hungary in a roundabout way to help Poles to actually fight the war. And there's an interesting memorandum of where 2 soldiers in retaking Ciechanów on the 16th come rushing in up a side street, shouting hurrah, and let off between the 3 of them a last bullet at the departing Cossacks. The name of those 2 soldiers was Henryk and Józef Falkowski. Perhaps they are, as it were, members of the family of our dear president. So here on the one hand, we have a whole series of circumstances which come together to maybe make victory a little easier. Certainly the capture of the radio station picked up morale in Sikorski's army and therefore allowed those soldiers to carry on further eastward. The second point I simply want to make is that in talking about victory on the Vistula, let's remember all the many personal defeats. Any reading of what happened even in the area around my family's place in Ciechanów, Płock, etc., the level of pillage, rape, murder of the Polish population by Cossacks and others was enormous. We have still to this day don't know how many thousands of Polish women were raped during the occupation of their towns. So there was a miracle on the one hand, but there was real agony on the other of those civilians, men, women, and children who had to suffer the occupation, however brief that was, by the Bolsheviks. The one positive side of it, and there is a long discussion we can have about what happened in some of those towns, was that, as one commentator said, it inoculated that part of Poland against communism for the foreseeable future. That's my first couple of points that I'd like to put to the historians. That is the extent to which happenstance, luck, sheer bravado, as the 203 Regiment of Ułany in Ciechanów on the 14th, 15th of August leads to the composite as it were, victory, which then figures under Pilsudski and others. It's interesting to note that both Tukhachevsky and Sikorski mentioned Chekhanov as being critical in the passage of the war. Pilsudski doesn't. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for the invitation and how much I've enjoyed Norman's broad brush explanation of why this was so significant. Paul's extraordinarily clear explanation of how and why the Poles won. And George's reminder to historians of how much they can learn from sociologists who will look at what is happening in a particular place and to particular people. Now, Norman quite rightly said that the Bolsheviks attacked Poland. I'm certainly not going to argue with that. One of the things that Paul said was that Pilsudski was aiming for a buffer state in Ukraine. In a sense, that was already Pilsudski's plan B, and in the end, Pilsudski would have to settle for plan C. But Pilsudski's plan A, had it come off, would have been even more significant than the result of the battle, because the idea was to recreate a much better version of the old republic, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of old, with the Polish crown and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, to create a federations of self-governing nations, Poles, Lithuanians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, in alliance with other powers from sea to sea, which would have been strong enough both to keep the Germans down and the Russians out. The classic strategic aim of NATO all those decades later. And had that come off, it would have been a very different future indeed, particularly for Ukrainians and Belarusians, who were the big losers of the Polish-Soviet war. It didn't come off, and in the end, they had to make the best of what was looking in the spring of 1920 as an extremely bad situation. Now, Poland succeeded in defending its independence and achieving moderately defensible frontiers in the east. In the process, it also defended the independence of Lithuania and the other Baltic states, Latvia and Estonia, although of course the Lithuanians were not going to be able to forgive the Poles for taking their capital. But those 20 years allowed Poland, Lithuania and the Baltic states to establish themselves with a tradition of modern nation statehood, something that would define them and give them strength for the rest of the 20th century. Whereas the experience of Ukrainians and Belarusians, particularly those Ukrainians and Belarusians who ended up in the Soviet Union, would be such as to make their experience of national democratic states that much more difficult when they finally got the opportunity in the 1990s. And we are now seeing the effects in Belarus, where things again hang in the balance to this day. Thank you, by the way, for the introduction, Kristina Fedorochov. Yes, Richard Butterwick-Pawlikowski, Professor of Polish-Lithuanian History at the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies. Now, there was a question that has come through from Anya about Polish zeitgeist. Perhaps you could put that to our panel this afternoon. So if we could unmute Anya, who is asking a question.
Richard, it might be just better if you just read it out for everyone.
Right, okay, I can do that.
Yeah, if you can do that. Because
how much of a part was played by the zeitgeist in newly liberated Poland? Perhaps we could put this one back to Norman first.
Would you translate zeitgeist for me?
Well, spirit of the times, atmosphere, mood music, you name it.
Poland in 1990 to 20 was very divided about its view of itself. What was Poland? Which I take to be the most important element of the zeitgeist. Pilsudski, as Richard has explained, belonged to those Poles who thought of the model of the old Polish-Lithuanian Republic, the Commonwealth, a multinational community of Poland and its neighbors. But at the same time, a strong strand of Polish opinion, led by Roman Dmowski, Pilsudski's chief political opponent, was much more nationalistic. He believed in, if you like, ethnic nationalism, Poland for the Poles, and the rivalry between Pilsudski and Dmowski was the principal feature of the political scene in the 1920s and 30s. The principal critics of Pilsudski, i.e. the people who invented the idea that this was a miracle on the Vistula and not what Paul explained as a masterclass in operational art. The people who tried to say this was a miracle of divine providence or good luck or whatever were the Dmowski people who wouldn't credit Pilsudski with any great success. So unfortunately, in that era, the Polish view of itself and the world was very divided. And one of the aspects of the miracle is that for a brief time they did come together and they defended the country against foreign attack.
Thank you, Norman. Paul, would you like to add something on the flavour of 1920 as Christina has now translated zeitgeist?
Yeah, I'll take a slightly different tact. You know, that it should be recognized that when the First World War ended and on the 11th November, the new Poland was reborn, that not everybody in the country was enthusiastically flocking to take up arms to defend the new country. I mean, the context of the Polish lands was that it had been fought over during the First World War, lots of destruction, loss of life. There was something in the order of 2 million Poles who served in the armies of Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Imperial Germany. And frankly, you know, for example, people in the countryside, the peasantry, were a bit suspicious of institutions like conscription. And, you know, if they didn't like Russian conscription, they didn't necessarily assume that Polish conscription was going to be a good thing for them. And so the zeitgeist was a bit mixed, at least in terms of response to protecting the nation, as it were, protecting independence. You know, other segments of society were far more enthusiastic and volunteered and so on. But one of the interesting things, and this sort of ties in with what Jerzy was talking about, is that once the Bolsheviks enter purely ethnographic Polish territory and the crisis is becoming very large, there is a sea change in attitudes, and there's a greater degree of unity. There's more willingness to volunteer. Indeed, I think there are more volunteers in the summer of 1920 that flock to the colors than they successive years of conscripts that are called up. And so, you know, this event actually, in its own, the very crisis, the very existential threat, I think probably did much to change and consolidate the zeitgeist, as it were, of Poland at large. I just want to comment on two other things. Jerzy talked about the Czachanowski raid. And it's an important moment in the Fifth Army sector. It does a very useful thing in terms of nearly bagging a Bolshevik division headquarters. They get plans, ciphers, and other things. It's a useful psychological shift on the battlefield. As for being some sort of critical event for the overarching scheme of things, I don't think so. But, you know, when you're talking about war, I think, and, you know, all these different events, luck, coincidences. I mean, Clausewitz, you know, the great dead German, as he's called in my department, is very much a figure who talks about the frictions of war, that it's bound up with chance, and that all of these factors come to play. And indeed, you know, the famous cliche is that that's rooted in Clausewitz, is that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So, and that the enemy has a vote. So war is a very interactive business, and you're going to get all sorts of things being turned up by events on the battlefield. But I have to say, because the Poles had the broad framework right and put it into place effectively, it was robust enough to deal with any of these frictions, inevitable frictions of the battlefield. Final quick point. I noticed there was on one of the chat things asking about Polish radio intelligence. This is an interesting element of the battle, and there's some exciting new research that's been going on in Poland over the last 10 years, where essentially a particular one scholar, I can't think of his name, has essentially argued this was Poland's first big Enigma effort, as the Polish army was reading a lot of Bolshevik signals. And I think there's interesting work going on trying to assess how reading this intelligence actually shaped things on the battlefield. Because even if you know what's going on, if you don't have enough resources, you don't have enough troops, things are going badly, the enemy's being better led at that point, no amount of situational awareness is necessarily going to make a difference. But it's an interesting area, and I think it's one that is perhaps going to be the area that's going to change our understanding of the mechanics of the Polish-Soviet War in military terms quite significantly over time.
Thank you, Paul. You've managed to answer the question that was put by Zbigniew Czachanowicz. Excuse me.
Yes, I was going to suggest having a nice drink or something just to take that away.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
I would...
George, can I also ask you to have a look at your WhatsApp?
Could I just very quickly follow up on what Paul was saying as well, because, and Norman and others, any reading of what happened in individual towns as they were approached, found, taken over, and then liberated, really does tell us something about what Annie was talking about, that the mood changes rapidly, the sense of solidarity becomes that much greater, differences which are quite enormous, political, social, cultural, religious, become, as it were, less important. And people then turn around. I mean, you've got to note that, for example, again, in Chechanov, when, and as I said, because it's my father and grandfather's hometown, I read about it quite a lot. When the Bolsheviks came, the peasants were very quick to rob their own landlords, you know, and when the Polish army then came in after they'd liberated a second time, the peasants complained that they took as much bread as the Bolsheviks. So their views are eternal. Peasants don't change in that sense. They're more worried about the loaf of bread they have. But in principle, I think it is critical that that experience of being faced by the enemy from the east probably creates, it's not a Gestalt switch, it's not a new zeitgeist, but it is part of, as we've said before, the foundation myth and a basis to a Polish solidarity, regardless of the Dmowski, Pilsudski division. I mean, there are other things. I mean, I'm always amazed by the way in which Poland's allies, as they were, really made it difficult for Poland to even fight the war. And if it wasn't due to the Hungarians showing up really positively, and the Romanians in this case, and allowing massive shipments of arms and munitions to come to Poland, who knows what the outcome would have been. It would have been a much longer war. And I'm not sure how the historians would look at this, but you know, it was really touch and go at times. And as I said earlier, it was only Skierniewice on the 12th that we saw a massive shipment of munitions. So there are these bigger questions, and I wonder how these entered into people's perception of their neighbors after 1920.
We have a question to Norman Davies from Christopher C. First of all, thanks for the trail of hope which changed his life. He had been in ignorance of what his grandfather had gone through. Is there any way in which he can find out more about his participation in the Polish Bolshevik War, except his name? You can find that in the chat section on the right. But while Norman perhaps prepares an answer to that one, there's a response here from Jan Latawski that while we're sort of piling into the Western Allies for being so unhelpful, the French record was much better than that of the British and the Americans. 120 Renault tanks, help for General Haller's forces. And I seem to remember that a certain young Charles de Gaulle conducted himself quite well in Poland in 1920.
Can I jump in on the French dimension and French help? I think it is quite interesting that Haller's force, when it was transferred to Poland, was the best equipped and best trained element, arguably, in the Polish army, more consistently equipped with scales of equipment that were comparable to what you found in the French army. And I think that made Haller's army quite a valuable asset in the particular circumstances. But I do think that one of the major problems that Poland faces is trying to actually put together an army from scratch. And to do this while you're essentially fighting a number of limited wars and then become engaged in a very large war with Bolshevik Russia. And you know, one of the things, you know, you find sometimes in histories, they keep talking about Poland fighting wars at all points of the compass and simultaneous. I think technically maybe simultaneous, but in fact, if you map when these conflicts were actually hot and when they were dormant, you've got actually a period from November 1918 until the June 1919, where essentially you've got a bit of breathing space to construct an army. And of course, the French military mission in particular was quite important. And what we often forget, it's not necessarily French officers in combat units mentoring or trying to shape how a combat unit operates in the field. It's setting up training establishments, organizing different training of soldiers and officers in different arms. And this isn't at all glamorous. It is the nuts and bolts stuff of creating an army. And to that extent, the French military mission was indeed really rather significant. And I wonder if, again, that's an area perhaps that deserves a bit more research.
Mm-hmm.
Norman.
Yes, I wasn't able to answer the question put by Chris, which is about how I think personal records, how do you find out about the service record of relations and so on? Paul is probably better informed than I am, but I found the Polish Army archives in Rembertów near Warsaw extremely helpful. My wife's grandfather was a general in 1920, or 1920 anyhow, and we received very full details of his military record, not only in the Polish army, but before in the Austro-Hungarian army. How complete their records are about, junior soldiers, I don't know. But this is a trail that's worth following. I don't know what you think, Paul, about how do people find out where their grandfather fought and so on?
And it's a very good question. Again, for officers, it's fairly easy. At Rembertów, I remember they've got this sort of 3x5 card file system that occupies an entire wall. And whatever records they've got and survive can be looked at there. And actually the records are actually quite full in terms of, particularly with officers' reports and so on. As far as ordinary soldiers, that's a question that I don't really know the answer. I would assume that, there must be regimental associations and records in Poland that have survived that'll give you some idea of who served when. I know, for example, that I think the Pilsudski Institute website in New York has the role of everybody who was served in the Polish legions of all ranks during the First World War, including when they were wounded and if they were wounded, that sort of thing. But as far as the mainstream Polish army, that's not a question I've had to address. So I can't really be any more specific than I have been.
George.
In short, I don't know the answer.
I think very quickly there, if you have an idea of what regiment your relative was, there are now very decent, it's not just Wikipedia, but histories of regiments. My father's regiment, with the 13th Pułk Piechoty, which took part in what the Poles choose to call one of their great Thermopylae events in 1921, and the Ukraine in September, where a handful held off a horde. But you can actually track down quite a lot of material. Secondly, there is a lot of social history now where local historians can actually tell you which civilians did what in opposing the Bolsheviks, who collaborated with the Bolsheviks, who was imprisoned and shot by the Bolsheviks, who was imprisoned and shot by the Poles when they came in after the Bolsheviks had been there. So there is more and more information now emerging about as it were, the average peasant person in the street and what they did and didn't do during the 1920 conflict. It's just a question of looking up the local, as it were, regional studies associations, looking up various monographs. And this is a good year to start because many towns have actually published quite interesting monographs about their experiences, different members of their towns during the Bolshevik War. So I think it's something that, as Paul said, there's more and more information available. It's something that's emerging, and I'm sure will provide people with a lot of scope for study.
All right, thank you. Thank you, George. There are a number of questions that are now sort of waiting in the queue. Jan Lidorowski has sort of asked about the telephonogram system in the Polish Army's communications. Perhaps Paul or Norman may be able to answer that one. Then there is also a further question from Marisha about de Gaulle's role. And there is also a question from Anya about prisoners of war. So 3 questions to choose from there. Please sort of expand at your leisure. Paul, if you'd like to go first.
I'm going to pass on the telephogram system. That's it's undoubtedly an interesting issue, but one I haven't done any work on, and I can't really offer anything constructive on it. Question about what did the Poles take away from this event in relation to the subsequent German invasion in September 39? Well, I would argue that one of the problems that comes away from this event is Piłsudski's dominant position, certainly with large chunks of the army. And then after the May 1926 coup, where he essentially retires lots of officers who had previously served in the Russian or Austro-Hungarian army and favored legionnaire officers for promotion, created conditions that, in my view, contributed to the very poor performance of senior Polish military leadership in 1939. Because if you think of it in these terms, that after 1926, the most dominant element of the army was one that probably amounted initially to no more than 15 to 20% of the officer corps, then becomes absolutely dominant in all the top command positions. And then when you add to it, it's the most amateur element in the Polish army in terms of its military training and experience. And you get a lot of people who are close to Piłsudski or trusted by Piłsudski, who are promoted into the senior levels of the army, commanding armies and corps districts and all this sort of thing. And frankly, they're not the best and the brightest of the pool of officers available. It's almost, he creates a 2-tier army where the ones who aren't being preferred for promotion because they're not legionnaires are the ones who are actually doing the hard graft of soldiering. And in fact, a lot of these fellows do rather well in the Second World War. People like Maciek and Anders, who are not part of the legionnaire scene. So, and then you add to that, Piłsudski was not very keen on technology, and he didn't actually see that war had changed or the means of war had changed. He was very anti new technologies, and generally speaking, he didn't like doctrine, but armies live by doctrine. That is the way in which they conceive they're going to fight. And he was, again, it all smacks of an amateur approach. And of course, when you have an amateur approach, what happens is something like the disaster in 1939. I think I've got all the other questions.
We've covered quite a few of them there. There was.
Can I say something about
perhaps
prisoners of war? I mean, it's a very touchy subject, because every time you read about a particular battle, you find many prisoners being taken, very often to the point where they can't be fed. They almost overwhelm the people that are actually taking them prisoner. And this is particularly the case as the war turns and the Bolsheviks begin to retreat. Secondly, there are also the situations where, if you read about, again, individual battles, there you find quite very difficult to, as it were, understand situations where soldiers are executed by the Bolsheviks, and in reply, the Poles execute the Bolsheviks. So you actually do, partly this is because they don't have the time or the space to take prisoners in a fast-moving maneuver of war. We have no idea of the total number of prisoners taken. It's anything between 75,000 to 100,000 Bolsheviks. We're not talking about those who escape into East Prussia and are interned. And we certainly don't know what the body count is. Norman may have better ideas about this, but I'm not sure whether the Russians have ever really released an accurate number of their losses. There was that situation which Norman mentions in one of his interviews, whereby he was giving a lecture about Katyn and 20,000 officers. And before he finished the lecture, this was in Moscow, somebody immediately handed out the leaflets saying, what about the 60,000 Russians that were executed in 1920? So it's still there in people's mentality, but how much accuracy we have about how many were killed, how many were captured. Some people even argue that many of the Russians never returned, they simply melted into the local population. But that's a different discussion.
Could I have a word about the prisoners? Numbers are very difficult. But George has preempted me on what I was going to say about some of the myths that fly around this. There's another curious and slightly shameful episode which hasn't been mentioned, namely that the Polish army interned several thousand of its own soldiers, Jewish soldiers, who were suspected of cooperating with the Russians or potentially being disloyal. We know this was not the case. The Bolsheviks made a huge propaganda attempt to recruit Poland's Jews to their side, and they were very unsuccessful. But the Polish army, in the heat of the summer of 1920, decided not to take any risks, and they did round up quite a number of their own soldiers, Jewish soldiers. And there was a parliamentary commission after the war into the details of this, which I found out quite by accident in the 1960s when I went to the Archiwum Magnowych, the Polish modern archives, and to the astonishment of the archivists, I asked if they could give me some files about 1920. And as you probably know, the War of 1920 didn't exist in the official mind. What they produced for me were the files about Jewish internment, which somebody thought was suitable for a foreign scholar to look at. But this Russian myth of the Poles having deliberately killed, enormous numbers. They peddled a number of 60,000 Soviet prisoners killed by the Poles. This is total fantasy. What is true and is not often mentioned is that the prisoner of war camps in 1920 and in 1921, after the war, were hit by disease, by cholera. And quite a lot, I think, thousands of Soviet prisoners did die from disease, but certainly not from deliberate actions. So it is very, even today, very difficult to sort out the myths and the deliberate misinformation, which the Russians are rather good at.
Thank you, Norman. We still have a question unanswered about the role of de Gaulle, who did actually get the Virtuti Militari Cross for his role in fighting at the key stage of the Battle of Warsaw. Perhaps Paul or Norman could comment on de Gaulle and Poland.
Not in detail, unfortunately. No, not me.
I can't talk in any detail about de Gaulle's experiences, but I would note that I at one point I looked at de Gaulle's papers have been published in a sort of multi-volume set, and he's got a very substantial section on his time in Poland, and so I think one could get a fuller picture from that particular source. But these are all very good questions. Unfortunately, I think most historians aren't totally encyclopedic about every aspect of what went on in a particular event in history. So
de Gaulle did change his opinion about Poles as a result of his experience in Poland in the summer of 1920. When he had first come, along with General Haller's army in 1919, he'd been extremely critical.
It is very, very interesting how, if you read all the accounts, first of all, the mission is surprised at the speed of the Bolshevik advance, and then it's equally surprised by the success of Pilsudski's repulsion of the Bolsheviks. So I think in many ways, their own experiences of the battle on the Western Front doesn't really lend, to my mind, make them very expert in assessing this war of maneuver, of the unexpected, of very, very fast coverage of rapid coverage of territory by men and horses, and the fact that you, as I said earlier, that it was a chessboard war. You weren't really sure where your enemy was until you happened upon them, and this seems to be something that happens all the time. And I'm pretty sure this is what the young Zielinski found again in Norman's memoir. But in terms, there was a chat question about the attitude of the West. And I was taken by, when I was looking at some of the reaction to the war in London, where there was a delegation of the committee to, I think, Hands Off Russia committee, went to the Polish embassy to protest about this attack by Poland on the revolution. And a diplomat called Mr. Wróblewski said, how would you receive a delegation from the Hands Off Turkey Committee in Warsaw? And I thought that was a rather nice reply to you. In a way, we've all got our problems, and you should be aware of we all have our own interests. But in principle, the West, it took a long time to come to terms with Pilsudski's victory, and I'm not sure whether that was bad PR or the inability to deal with the outcome of the unexpected, or sympathy to Russia.
We also have a, yes, Norman.
Yes, I was just going to add to what George was saying. Western attitudes, British, French, American attitudes in this period were strongly influenced by the fact that Russia had been an ally during the First World War. Russia was not seen as an aggressive empire trying to overrun foreign territory. Quite the opposite. People were saying, well, Warsaw had been in the Russian Empire in 1914. The Russians were on there, as it were, recovering their rightful territory. But British sympathies in particular were very much in favor of the Bolsheviks. Lloyd George couldn't understand that the Poles had not attacked Russia. This turns on the fact that Pilsudski had allied with the Ukrainian Directorate. Ukraine was already an independent republic. Kiev was not in Russia. Kiev was the capital of Ukraine. And by allying with the Ukrainians and moving to Kiev, the Poles were not attacking Russia. And yet the Prime Minister of Great Britain couldn't understand, basic questions of where countries were and where they weren't. Of course, as I said before, the Bolshevik propaganda was very effective. The Hands Off Russia movement was, of course, born in Russia and taken up by the British trade unions. And nobody, Ernie Bevin, who was one of the leader of the unions who went on strike at the time, no clue as to where the new Poland was or the new Ukraine or what Soviet Russia was. All they knew is that this former ally, Russia, was fighting the war against a country they'd never heard of, namely Poland, which hadn't been in existence in 1914. So I think confusion and misunderstanding is a big part of the whole scene.
May I add something on that note of the issue of Western opinion? What I think is quite interesting during the First World War is that there really isn't much of any expertise in British universities or officialdom on that part of the world, on the eastern half of the European continent. Russia perhaps enjoys the most interest, perhaps parts of the Balkans, but it's quite interesting with the internationalization, progressive internationalization of the Polish question during the First World War. There is a requirement for more expertise, and this is where you see coming to the fore in the Foreign Office a certain Louis Namier, who actually is originally from Galicia. And Namier is not an individual. He has you can almost imagine Namier as being part of the Polish political debate rather than an independent expert. And he has very distinct views on what the territory of Poland should look like. He doesn't have any time for Dmowski or the National Democrats. He's probably more supportive of Piłsudski, but with a lot of caveats along the way, becoming more disillusioned as well. And he doesn't, for example, see Ukrainians as having a separate identity. He sees them as essentially being a form of Russian. And he wrote I think it was in the New Statesman, a very famous article where he had this wonderful phrase where he said, you can put all of the Ukrainian nationalists on one large sofa. And the interesting thing about Namier's role and the role of a few of other sort of academics turned experts in the Foreign Office is the memorandum that they wrote in the morning in their official duties would end up being published in the New Statesman as an article on these issues shortly thereafter. And they had, as a consequence, it seems to me, a disproportionate effect in forming what we call today, it's very fashionable, creating a narrative about something. And I think people like Namier were very instrumental in creating what was actually a fairly negative British narrative about Poland that in many ways certainly persisted through to the Second World War. And maybe even in recent years, we've seen over Polish immigration echoes of that negative narrative again playing out in parts of society. So it seems to me, I agree with what Norman says, but there's also this added element of perhaps establishment views in Britain being shaped from within by characters like Namier.
Namier in 1920 was a very junior clerk. He wasn't even a Foreign Office official.
No, not by then, yeah.
He was the only person around who could understand Polish.
Yes.
There is one question which no one has yet addressed, and that is the specific role of the cavalry in 1920. It has the reputation of being the last great cavalry war in European history. And the idea is sometimes linked with this myth of Polish cavalry charging German tanks in 1939. You know, the idea being that you see, it worked in 1920, so why didn't it work in 1939? Perhaps that's a myth that needs to be well and truly punctured.
I think Norman could provide us with the colour of the last great charge and counter-charge battle between Polish lancers and Budyonny's cavalry.
Yeah. Well, I'll try. You must remember, I was studying this 50 years ago. So I actually met in the late 60s, early 70s, several Polish officers who'd fought in the Battle of Komarów, sometimes called the Zamość Ring, after the Battle of Warsaw, early September, where Budyonny's Konarmia was surrounded and engaged in a very fierce cavalry battle. Several divisions of Soviet and several divisions of Polish cavalry charging each other in almost medieval ways. There's, of course, a lot of legends about this, but it certainly was a the survival of form of warfare which had existed for centuries, but was still critical in 1920. By 1939, although all the combatant armies had large numbers of cavalry, the Germans, the Soviets, the British Expeditionary Force to France in 1939, large cavalry contingents, but they were already, as it were, obsolete. They couldn't perform the wonders that they had in the past. So in a way, this battle near Zamość between two cavalry armies was the last. It's a word, isn't it? The last charge of the Uhlans.
I think if you think about the terrain, particularly on the northern front, around Mazowsze, flat rivers and streams, and it really was perfect terrain for movement on horses. You probably could get bogged down, and weather does come into it, but there was a very interesting story about one particular confrontation, and this is where luck and weather comes in, where a particular assault was taking place by Polish soldiers against a much larger number of Bolsheviks. And because it'd been a dry summer and there was a lot of dust, the Bolsheviks couldn't actually see the number of Poles that were attacking them. So in many ways, weather always comes into it, but in the most unexpected way. But I think one of the ways in which you describe and others have described is really quite fearsome, that these lancers shredded their opponents. I mean, it's not just, like a good old medieval joust. I mean, they are actually being really quite brutal and bloodthirsty in the damage that they can do in their charge with their lancers.
Can I be a bit of a dissenting voice on the romance of cavalry? Because I think, well, I accept there are a number of instances where traditional cavalry action involving saber and lance did take place in the Polish-Soviet War. Generally, since the American Civil War, cavalry have been nothing more than mounted infantry. And the large scale of cavalry forces on both sides was largely dictated by vast distances and the need for mobility of troops. But generally speaking, cavalry, even Polish cavalry in 1920, would usually, they were essentially horse-mounted infantry. Horses were sent to the rear and they fought a close contact with the enemy on foot. But I do think there are some distorting lessons about the continuing importance of cavalry that do come out of the war, so that you know, the idea of motorizing the Polish army is taken up very late in the 1930s, and cavalry still has an importance to the very end. Although it's interesting, you know, as late as 1940, the US Army still had mounted cavalry units, and rather bizarrely, they would be deployed on maneuvers in large horse-carrying trucks that would carry the horses to the point where they would then mount the troops. I think there's something about the romance of the horse in warfare that has perhaps led it to being too long carrying on.
But if you have no ammunition, a sword or a lance might actually stand you in good stead.
Or indeed a bayonet.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I can't see any further questions. I mean, there have been some points about the role of cavalry in 1939, which is a slightly different issue, and there have been a lot of useful information exchanged on the chat about how to look up ancestors. So thank you for all of those. There's a question of the role of the Ukraine at that time. That's just come in. Perhaps I could come in on this one. And the idea of a Ukrainian nation is still disputed by certain people, including Vladimir Putin. But the idea of a Ukrainian nation is certainly around by the middle of the 19th century. And it can be, and clearly there are distinctions between the sort of East Slavs who live in what used to be the east of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Great Russians further to the northeast. And that by the end of the First World War, particularly as a result of the way in which the Ukrainian idea had developed under Austrian rule in the Habsburg monarchy, then there is a real chance to establish an independent Ukrainian state. There is a problem in that a lot of the territory claimed by a Ukrainian state is also territory that is claimed by Poland. And before the Poles and the Ukrainians can form an alliance against the Bolsheviks in 1920, they're fighting out over the city that one side calls Lvov and the other side calls Lviv through the winter of 1918 to 19. But yeah, Ukraine is a going concern, much more so than Belarus at that particular time. And it's a particular tragedy that Ukraine was divided in two at the end of the war. And that sort of about 4 million Ukrainians perished as a result of being deliberately starved to death by Stalin in 1932 to 1933. However bad it was in interwar Poland for them, it's considerably worse in the Soviet Union.
Could I just ask Richard, I did read in looking through this that as a consequence of the war and the treaty and the peace treaty, Poland effectively obtained its borders as they were in 1793. Is that the case?
1793, the second partition of Poland.
Yeah.
Slightly better than that, particularly in the Pripyat marshes, which Pilsudski had identified as particularly strategically important. For the purposes of defending the frontiers, you want to go as far east as possible in the Pripyat marshes, but you don't necessarily want to worry about cities like Minsk. As a result, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania historically gets cut in two and the territories of, and the sort of the southeastern territories of the old Commonwealth also get cut in two as a result of 1921. So the result is you have a Poland which is maybe sort of 2/3 ethnic Polish, 1/3 minorities, which is perhaps not homogeneous enough, but too homogeneous to have a real go at the at a sort of a multinational sort of state patriotism that Pilsudski would have preferred to have endorsed. But one of the things that Andrzej Nowak has sort of introduced into the discussion is that perhaps Pilsudski and Dmowski weren't quite as far apart as they're generally portrayed as, and that once Pilsudski realized that Plan A wasn't going to come off, the important thing was to defend Poland's independence with the most defensible frontier possible. And in that, he was much closer to Dmowski, who was left to handle things with the West, whereas Pilsudski took care of the East.
Thank you.
Norman.
I just wanted to add a sort of topical rider to what you were saying about Belarus, as we now call it, which is on our television screens every day. And one of the interesting things, you may see that a lot of the demonstrators carry flags with the symbol of the pogon, the rider, the pahonia, as they call it, with the symbol of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And the memory of the ancient Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which had been destroyed in 1795, lived on. In the time that we're talking about, 1919 to 20, the Bolsheviks, well, first of all, there was a very brief Belarusian National Republic, which lasted for something like 2 weeks, although its government in exile lived on in New York for, I don't know, 50 or 60 years. But after that, the Bolsheviks created what they call the Lit-Biel, the Lithuanian Belarusian Bolshevik Republic, Soviet Republic. And what that was the Bolshevik recreation of the Grand Duchy, Lithuania and Belarus together. So they had this, the old Commonwealth in mind, as do today. A lot of those Belarusians, they know in their heads that Belarus is not Russia because it has a different history. And the biggest chunk of that history was in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which of course they think was theirs. Belarusians think that Vilnius was theirs. There were more Belarusians living in Vilna in 1919 to 20 than there were Lithuanians. So these are echoes of the past that go on, and you can see it on your screens. If you just look at Belsat, the Belarusian channel online, very easy to look at. You'll see these symbols of the old Grand Duchy being carried by young people today.
There is one question that, to go back to the very beginning, in the opinion of the historians, if Lenin had made it to Germany, and on the basis of the experience of the Spartacist collapsed revolution, but the general leftedness, as it were, of the trade unions, which had done, their work in stopping arms coming to Poland, and also the experience of Bela Kun in Hungary and the short-lived Soviet there. What would, if looking at it counterfactually, if he had made it and gone through Poland and defeated the Poles, in your views, what would Europe have looked like by, say, 1922, 23?
Well, all hell would have been let loose, but I don't think Lenin had many chances of success. Lenin's basic delusion was that the peasants and working class of Europe would welcome the Red Army, that almost there didn't have to be any fighting, that the oppressed society of Europe would welcome the arrival of the Red Army. And this, as it proved in Poland, to be just a delusion. There are lots of things wrong in Polish society, a lot of people unhappy with the lot, but one thing that they didn't want was this form of Bolshevik dictatorship. To which I should add that if the Bolsheviks had been around for a bit longer, Felix Jerzy, head of the predecessor of the KGB, was only 3 weeks in the plebania at Vyshkov, outside Warsaw. But Lenin was sending him telegrams saying, you should kill a few more landowners. Like he's talking about massacring 100,000 Polish landowners to, as it were, encourage the peasants to be more cooperative. So I think the Bolsheviks, were much worse than they're actually described. They'd already committed mass horrors of various sorts in Russia itself, and if they'd established their People's Republic in 1920, the horrors would have been really dreadful.
But one of the things the Bolsheviks did do when in those territories they took over, they set up their revolutionary committees. They recruited local peasants, workers, and some intellectuals onto them. What they didn't realize was that the peasants, when they attacked the ziemiany, their estates, all they wanted was land for themselves. They didn't actually want to enter into any kind of collective farm or whatever, which is what would have awaited them a few years down the road. But the most interesting thing I think you also pointed out was that with Lenin's defeat and with the defeat of the Bolsheviks, Lenin immediately introduces the new economic policy. And socialism in one country gradually emerges. So it becomes critical in policy terms that the defeat has an impact internally, not just Stalin's execution of Tukhachevsky and some of his people, but in terms of policy and the way in which the Soviet revolution then develops because of that defeat in the West. And that, I think, is quite an interesting story to tell students, because they all think there's some natural development from the Red Terror to, some kind of playing around with Kronstadt until NEP happens after 21. So I think the Poles were actually contributed to the development of a Soviet policy.
Stalinism, you mean?
Yes. Eventually.
For Stalin, yes.
Eventually Stalinism, yeah. But
may I come in on the counterfactual element? I don't actually think the Bolsheviks in 1920 had the strength to really trigger a more widespread revolution in Germany and beyond. The reality was that by the time they were reaching Western Belarus, the impetus of their offensive was already flagging a bit. They reached what the Soviet Red Army liked to call the culmination point of the offensive. And so that even if they had won in August 1920, they still had the problem of occupying and taking all of Poland, which doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be straightforward. You still have a government, you still have an army, albeit defeated under those circumstances. And And I also think that in Germany, the forces of the right handled the left wing rebellions rather effectively and brutally. And I think the more likely outcome, if you in the counterfactual world, had the Bolsheviks succeeded in taking all of Poland and holding it, is that they would have maybe cut a deal with Germany that would have given Germany control of Polish territory it previously had, some sort of early Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, as you were, to scupper the Versailles Treaty, all with the argument that were the bulwark against the evil Bolsheviks. So, anyways, that would be my counterfactual tale, as it were.
We've also got a question about whether the Poles won the war but lost the peace. Whether it would have been in the Poles' interest to have claimed a bit more territory in the east to the territory they were actually able to get, or whether this was actually the best that could be achieved at the time, and the conflict over the supposed treachery of the Polish delegation at Riga has been exaggerated. Perhaps sort of welcome sort of Norman's views on that one.
I seem to remember that in October 1920, Lenin, realizing that he had been militarily defeated, more or less offered the Poles as much as they wanted, as long as they made a decision within a short number of days. And you have to take into consideration the Bolshevik views of, they weren't really interested in territory and frontiers. They had this theory that the local population, the peasants would decide things, and that they had this strange idea that they were somehow favorable to the peasants. They, as Russia was a peasant country, and it had to be conquered by brute force. The Bolsheviks didn't win the civil war by acclamation of the population. They were a very brutal, I think, deluded outfit. Lenin in October 1920 would have happily ceded territory in the belief that it would soon be recovered, which it wasn't. But I think dealing with the Bolsheviks was rather trickier than dealing with many other people at the time.
I think one of the interesting points that somebody once made was it gave Poland 20 years of independent development. Anarchic it may have been, it may not have been the most rapid industrial development, but it was still 20 years. And the other counterfactual is, if Poland had become a Soviet, would it have been closer to Belarus and Ukraine in terms of its development? Or did those 20 years in some way seed certain democratic ideals? I mean, 106 political parties is a lot, but it's still democracy of a form, despite what happens in under Sanacja. And at the same time, there is the development of gradual development of a middle class. There is some more working class development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you could argue that 20 years, regardless of what happens in 39, does give Poland a little bit more breathing space, and that pays off after 1989 or during the 1980s.
Hello.
I'm trying to tell us something.
I think it does, actually.
Yes. I was just going to jump in there and actually say it's already 9:20, and we were only planning to have a sort of half an hour of discussion, to be quite honest. But you've gone well over the call of duty, Norman, and thanks to George and Richard, and of course to Paul, who had such an amazing sort of military aspect to it. But I still want to know about the Hungarians.
Well, I think the Hungarians were one of the only country which did supply arms and ammunition to beleaguered Poland. The Czechoslovakia, for example, was very much opposed to the Polish position. In Germany, I think George mentioned Gdańsk. No supplies came in through Gdańsk. So I did have an email the other day from a lady saying that why does nobody talk about the Hungarians? The Hungarians saved the Poles in the Battle of Warsaw.
Must be the same lady that I know.
I think there has been some publication on this front, and it is a convoluted story from Trianon onwards. But when you consider what the Hungarians suffered in terms of being, what their reparations were, what the Romanians took from them, and what the Czechs took from them, the fact that even limited as they were in their resources, they seemed to do everything possible to find routes to both produce munitions, but to also send munitions that were coming from France. And so when the Austrians embargoed, they then found the Yugoslavs chipped in, and somehow or other they were able to channel these arms. And what was important for Poland, isolated as it was a morale boost, that there was somebody out there who was really literally gunning for them, looking after their guns, trying to make sure that they were armed, and that somehow or other had bullets for their French rifles, their British rifles. I mean, when I was just wondering what rifle Norman's in-law carried.
It was an English Enfield rifle. Yeah.
Was it a 303? God help him. So I think it's true that the one positive side was that once Trianon happened, Poland and Hungary didn't have a common border, so they had no irredentist claims against each other. And so Hungary had an interest, and in fact, as we know, signed a treaty in secret with the Poles to deal with the Czechs should things start to go wrong there. So in a way, the Hungarians and the Poles did collaborate in the Battle of Warsaw, and I'm hoping that this is something that the Poles recognize on a daily basis. So certainly what Norman has said, and whoever intervened on that front, yes, let's talk about it a bit more and give it more airtime,
Well, thank you to you all for participating in this sort of first historical Hearthside adventure that we have had on the centenary of such an important victory. And I think one of the last sort of questions, perhaps if I may, to go around the table is how has this in fact affected the Polish psyche of today? So perhaps Norman.
There are 40 million Poles, and there are lots of different psyches, and it's too complicated to get into now. But I think the group of Poles who are most likely to have been, whose psyche is most likely to be affected by the events of 1920.
I think so, and perhaps Paul as well. What would you suggest to everyone?
Well, I think, again, to say there's one general effect today of this battle is probably stretching things a bit far. What I would put to you is you know, that one would expect that the Battle of Warsaw would return to be the kind of a centerpiece of the national narrative. But, you know, Poland, since the end of communism, does have these contradictions. I'm always struck by the fact that, you know, despite this return to the legacy of the Second Republic, and by ipso facto, that would be include the exile government as being a continuation of the Second Republic, the Polish army of today still has divisions and formation numbers and names that harken back to the Polish People's Army rather than the pre-war army. So I think there's a lot of contradictions. Plus, you've got, you know, a lot of young people in Poland who may not be so interested in history as being so important in everyday life. You know, that, you know, it's much, Poland is,
Yes,
in respect, like UK and any other
yes.
country. You know, there are other things on people's agendas than the Battle of Warsaw, sadly.
Well, I know from when you were lecturing at CEAS, you know, you look so much different, and your hair, I do believe, was around your shoulders in those days. So it was quite a different sort of setup.
It's been a long time
Norman.
since I touched my shoulders.
But, you know, the thing is that what we need to actually talk about is, you know, the continuation of history and the transmission of history. Perhaps the young at the moment don't know or understand or wish to understand, but eventually it all affects them. It all does so affect everyone. Richard, can I call out to you and see your thoughts?
Well, thank you. I mean, I am in Warsaw at the moment. So
Absolutely, yeah.
Through the last few days, when, to be honest, not a huge amount has been happening in terms of sort of commemorations and mass celebrations. But the reason for that is because we've got the COVID-19 virus, and the sort of celebrations have been vastly scaled down. Walking in the center of Warsaw on the 16th of August, well, there were a lot of policemen there. They were there to protect the statues from rainbow flag waving protesters, and at the same time they were there to guard against the COVID conspiracy mob, and at the same time they were there to guard against the sort of the neo-Franco-fascist organization of nationalist radicals. So at the Battle of Warsaw, yes, there were some tanks and vehicles on Piłsudski Square in the center of town, which some kids were playing around in, being shown by the soldiers, but it was hardly a sort of a mass occasion. There's certainly a large group of Poles who felt rather marginalized over the last sort of couple of decades, who for whom the idea of a Polish identity, this is who we are, and we can win sometimes. You know, 1920, you know, that can be important, but there are plenty more who are disgusted by the manipulation of a very one-sided, xenophobic and chauvinistic approach to history, which the current government is pressing at the moment.
Yes, it's all about politics and military, you know, and I think the last word must go to the sociologist here. George, what are your thoughts?
I go back to just looking at it from outside. The more you listen, the more you read, etc., the more difficult it is to actually take any lessons from this, except one, and that is that divided as Poland may be now, rozproszony and splintered as it was in 1920, when faced with an existential crisis, there is the belief that Poles will come together, whether they're 16-year-old guides and scouts, whether they're peasants or workers, religious, intellectuals, landowners, the rich and the poor, that they will bury their differences and come. That must be the only lesson that I could learn from that particular event. That is that deep down at the kind of genotypical level, Poles recognize that their existence depends upon them overcoming differences, which very often are, okay, they're differences of values, differences of perceptions. Some of them are really quite heinous, others are very noble. But in the end, if seen by an existential threat, they can transcend that and come together. That's the only thing that I could take from 1920, which was extraordinary, as we know, in terms of the extremes that the Poles faced and the way in which they mobilized. And the more you read about how different parts and different people, different groups did mobilize in their own private individual ways to provide this collective effort, not in the service of any ideology, and almost not in the service of nationalism, but let's go back to that word, but in the service of patriotism. That's
well, yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for that, George. Perhaps I can also mention to everyone listening all about the one aspect is the visual aspect and Polish posters. And if I can draw everyone's attention to the wonderful poster behind us that was used in some of our publicity items, we also had here in London the Polish Victims Relief Fund, which was actually set up by Ignacy Paderewski and Henryk Sienkiewicz in Switzerland. And there was a certain lady, Lawrence Almatadima, who actually sort of went, an amazing woman whose father also painted Paderewski. And, you know, this poster, visual aspects are so important to actually creating this miracle on the Vistula. So all I can say is perhaps it wasn't just a miracle on the Vistula, but also a miracle on the Thames. So on that note, can I say thank you again to Norman Davies, Paul Latawski, Richard Butterwick-Pawlikowski, and of course our very own George Kolankiewicz. So with that, I would like to hand over, but before I hand over to the chairman, I hope he's ready. We have to give a huge thank you to all the people in the background, all the controllers who were pushing and pulling all these sort of buttons and everything else. So, you know, fantastic teamwork. Many thanks to all of you who attended, and I hope we can continue with a sort of a follow-up to all of this. So again, I hand you over to our chairman, Jan Falkowski. Are you there?
Yes, thank you, Lech. I mean, I'd just echo everything you, Lech, said. Thank you very much for our speakers. Norman put the context of the war and the battle in a very, very succinct way. Paul gave us some marvelous insight into the military strategy and tactical factors. And then George and Richard helped have a very enlightening and thought-provoking panel discussion. And I think perhaps the most interesting thing is all the questions coming out of it suggest we need to do more events like this. As you, Lech, said, we need to thank all the people, including Lech, who worked so hard to produce this event. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I wish you well. And after this, we're now going to move out into discussion groups. So if you want to carry on and have a good discussion with a quiet drink, please feel free to.
Mm-hmm.
Good night.
Good night. I have to leave. Good night.
Thank you, Norman.
Okay.
Yes, and also we can't forget about thanking the Polish Institute and Sikorski Museum.
And Roger Morehouse is talking about his first fight book, which will be launched in paperback at Ognisko
that's true.
On the 3rd of September.
I think we're all being moved to rooms, so I hope everyone enjoyed it, and hope to see some of you in some of the rooms.
Raduje się dusza, gdy pierwsza kadrowa na wojenkę rusza. Hojda dana kompanio, kochana, nie masz, to jak pierwsza nie masz, nie. Hojda dana kompanio, kochana, nie masz, to jak pierwsza nie